This is a screencast for Unit 2.4, which is Tolerance and Limiting Factors. An important vocabulary term that you should know is the range of tolerance. So when you have a population of animals or plants, they thrive within certain ranges of abiotic factors, right? So let's say you are a fish in the water. The water has a certain pH, and if the pH gets too high or too low, then as a fish, you cannot survive in that water if it's too high or too low. In fact, there's an optimal range where you can thrive as a fish, but as you get away from the optimal range, the fish may not thrive. They might survive, but you might have a smaller population than you would if it were in an optimal range. And this is true for any sort of abiotic factor, such as temperature, which is especially true for terrestrial biomes, as well as aquatic biomes. Light affects both terrestrial and aquatic biomes. Amount of moisture, of course, is just for terrestrial biomes, and of course there are plenty of other abiotic factors as well. Rainfall is an issue, I guess, amount of moisture, but humidity or lack of humidity, these can all result in different ranges of tolerance. And of course they overlap as well. Temperature and rainfall combine in certain ways to make certain biomes more or less habitable for different organisms. So because there is a range of tolerance, there are what we call limiting factors. And so a limiting factor is specifically the environmental factor that is most often in short supply. So for example, in a desert, you could have a tropical desert, or you could have a Arctic desert. But in both cases, usually the thing that is in short supply is the rain. And so that might be a limiting factor in those environments. So when you look at a biome, you want to evaluate the factors that are available to the organisms there. And even if all factors are optimal, if there's one that is not optimal, then that's the one that's going to be the limiting factor and is going to prevent more population growth. So for different substances, we're going to look at important limiting factors. So for terrestrial biomes, where plants have to live and grow in soil, we'll see that nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium are the limiting factors in terrestrial biomes. So this is especially true for agriculture. And if you see any soil test kit, as you will in this class, they are often called NPK testing kits, right, for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And often fertilizers that are used in agriculture are rated based on their NPK percentages. If you go to an aquatic biome, such as the open ocean, you'll see limiting factors such as nitrogen, silica, or iron, because a lot of those are derived from sediment that is carried into the sea from things like rivers and streams and so forth. So how much sediment is carried into the sea is the limiting factor. The further out you go from land, then the less of those nutrients are there. Occasionally dissolved oxygen is a limiting factor in the ocean, and we'll see that before the end of this PowerPoint. Often in freshwater lakes or rivers, phosphorus is a limiting factor. And this is one reason why runoff from agriculture is a problem, because if farmers are putting a lot of fertilizer on their fields, which contains a lot of phosphorus, which is a limiting factor in soil, then this can get carried by runoff from rain into lakes and rivers, and that causes species to grow which wouldn't otherwise grow because phosphorus is a limiting factor. In bays and estuaries that are close to the ocean, salinity is the limiting factor, where certain species can thrive or be alive based on the salt content, whether it's too high or too low. And so if you get a huge influx of salt, that can be good or bad depending on what type of organism you are. So take a moment to consider these different habitats, right? In rainforest, the floor plants, what do you think is a limiting factor for their growth? For desert plants, which I mentioned offhand earlier, like what would be a limiting factor there? And then finally, in a fish tank, as you can see from the little cartoon, what do you think the limiting factor is there? Like, why do we have these little things that put off air bubbles in fish tanks? So let's say you've got this stream or lake that's next to an agricultural field, and the only thing that's holding back algae from growing is uh, a limiting factor, right? A nutrient like nitrogen or potassium. So what happens when it's added all at once? You get an algal bloom. And of course, this is a problem because if there is anything trying to live underneath this algae, then what limiting factor is being blocked by all this algal growth? Yeah, it's the sunlight, right? So other plants that are down there may not be able to grow. And then another problem is that the algae, will eventually start to die and decompose. And when that happens, the decomposers are going to put off a lot of not oxygen gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And when that happens, that consumes the oxygen that's in the water, and that can cause fish to die if they don't have enough oxygen. That becomes their limiting factor. So algal blooms are bad for a lot of reasons. They can affect all kinds of plants or animals. All right, that is the limiting factors screencast. Let me know if you have any questions.